Welcome to this session on giving and receiving feedback. I'm Bob Blum. I'm the William H. Gates Senior Professor and Chair of the Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health here at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. It's a pleasure for me to be able to share with you some of my thoughts about giving and receiving feedback. I would suggest it's one of the most important roles and one of the most poorly done activities. People in leadership positions and people who have responsibility for supervising others. We don't like, by and far, giving, quote, bad news, and as a consequence, we frequently, way too frequently, avoid doing it. The consequence, I would suggest, is that we rob people for whom we have supervisory responsibility of the opportunity to grow. Feedback is not, if it is done correctly, a personal attack. Feedback is to give an individual information on performance that allows for improvement and growth. We all need that. So think about a situation. You work in a large NGO. You work in a health department. And on the teams you supervise, there are 12 people, one of whom, John, is viewed by others as not a team player. He's seen as arrogant, controlling, undermining of the rest of the team. And it impacts their morale and it impacts their productivity. As a supervisor, you need to meet with John and give him feedback. What are you going to say? How are you going to say it? How are you going to structure it? How are you going to think about the physical environment? What are the questions you're going to ask him to begin to deal with this? I'd ask you to take a couple of minutes and just jot some notes about your approach. Now let's go on. So what is feedback? Well, one way to think about this whole area that I particularly find useful is known as the Johari Window. And the Johari Window looks at two dimensions, essentially. The extent to which you know yourself and the extent that your behaviors are known to yourself and not known to yourself, and to which they are seen by others and not seen by others. So in this construct, Johari says, if you have an awareness of it, but others don't, it's hidden. It's open if both you and others know it. If others know it and you don't, you're blind to something. And that's an area where too often many of us are. And if it's not known to you and not known to others, then it's just unknown. And like, who cares? So then, as we think about feedback, a quote from Morgan McCall that I like is, as managers grow more successful and gain more authority, the availability of feedback tends to decrease. People reporting to them have more to lose than to gain by taking the risk of getting negative feedback, and successful people have a tendency to believe that they don't need much feedback anyway from those they perceive to be less able than themselves. This is a fatal flaw. Many people in leadership positions surround themselves with others who do not point out their weaknesses, who avoid pointing out things they could do differently to improve. They avoid hiring people who can point out strategies and approaches that they could do differently that would improve productivity. And it can be fatal. And when I say fatal, I don't mean just fatal in a social structure. I mean fatal. Let me give you one example. When air crash analyses have been done, they disproportionately occur in airlines from countries that are highly socially rigid, hierarchical structures where a co-pilot does not feel at all empowered to say to the pilot, who is more senior than her or him, I see a problem here. You should do this, not that. And that failure has led to crashes, fatal crashes. So the ability to give feedback and to create an environment that encourages that is vitally important for the health of an organization. Perception is a very powerful phenomenon, and it is the lens by which others measure us. We're measured not only by what we are, but by the perception of what we seem to be. Not by what we say, but how we're heard, and not by what we do, but how we appear to do it. The public presentation of our work is critically important. I think it's captured well in this cartoon. You're fair, compassionate, and intelligent, but you're perceived as biased, callous, and dumb. La Rochefoucauld, I think, captured it terrifically well and accurately when he said, our enemies' opinions of ourselves come closer to the truth than our own. There was a study that was done years ago. I believe it was done up in Radcliffe College, and it looked at the phenomenon of people who disliked certain people. So the question that the researchers looked at, is there someone that you really dislike? And they asked a panel of college students to identify that person. And then they went and did personality testing of the subjects. And then they went and recruited some of these young people who were identified as people that the subjects really disliked. What the researchers found was that there were a lot of commonalities between the subjects and the disliked persons. And what they disliked about those people were the qualities that they saw in themselves that they disliked. So these people who the college students disliked were like mirrors reflecting back onto them personal elements that they would rather not look at. So feedback is not information. My example here might be a little bit dated from a year ago, but it's not to say, last night I would have rather go see Argo than to go see Lincoln. That's not feedback. That's to say, why didn't you say that last night? Feedback is also not sharing anger or frustration. Now, there may be times when you do share anger and frustration, but don't confuse that with feedback. Feedback is directed toward an individual, but it's not about the person. It is about behaviors and actions, and it is concrete, and it is specific. So to be effective, it requires an individual who can communicate well and one who is in a position to hear. If you can communicate, but the person who is receiving this feedback feels vulnerable or defensive, then it isn't really communication. You want to create, to the extent possible, an environment that allows for that kind of communication. Now, there may be times when you're not giving feedback, where you see a problem, a behavior, where you want to send a message. In this organization, what you did is intolerable. Now, this is not per se that same level of feedback because you really are giving a warning. Here, you really are using information and feedback to help the individual grow. That's different than a warning. Your goal is to maintain a relationship that is open, that's honest, and that's intact, where the person feels they can grow from that. And it reinforces the value of feedback. So I had a very recent experience with a fairly senior person for whom I have supervisory responsibility. And I felt that she was not being sufficiently clear and, more importantly, sufficiently direct with others, and particularly others who are as or perhaps more senior than she is, but where she has responsibility for the work and they're part of the working team. So she said, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know how to do it. And we spent about a half hour talking about very specific situations and then role-playing it, talking about, well, what if you approached it this way? This is how I would approach this, and going back and forth. And less than a week later, she sent me an email, not only thanking me, but saying, I had the opportunity just yesterday to use some of the things that we discussed, and it felt like I was much clearer as well as more supportive of the person. That's the goal that you strive for. So feedback, I would suggest, has a lot of value. It helps you in that Johari window reduce blind spots, things that others may be seeing that you don't see. It builds awareness of strengths that you also might not see. So feedback is not all pointing out problems and limitations, but also strengths and discussing those strengths so as to enhance them. It allows you to set targets as an employee of things that you want to be able to do better and look at strategies to accomplish that. And it provides perception data around behavior that may need to change or communication, and that addressing perceptions, because perceptions are as much a part of who you are as what you do. Changing perceptions may be what is needed and not changing what you do per se. But there's some cautions about feedback as well. And I would suggest there is, as the provider of feedback, a substantial amount of humility that must be part of this equation. So feedback is based on perceptions. Now, you as a supervisor might obtain a fair amount of input from others around a situation or a behavior or an event. But again, this is perception data, and be aware that often going into a feedback session, the individual's perception might not align with it. How you give feedback says as much about you as it does about the content of the feedback that you're given. People vary in their response styles, from being overly lenient to overly critical. Be very aware of your style, your body language, where you sit, how close you stand to an individual, your voice tone, your modulation, as well as the content of feedback. And the other thing to be aware of feedback is that the individual providing it might not have a lot of data. It may be based on a small snapshot in time. As someone providing feedback, you should strive to get as much information and as much data as you can to be effective.